We've got to the end of what economic growth can do for us in the rich developed countries.
Fascination with growth also is not based on a real increase in people's quality of life.
In Britain, we're living as though we had 3 planets, but of course we've only got one.
You push an ecosystem to a tipping point at which it might sort of break down.
We desperately need an economics that allows for stability without relentless growth in consumption.
We wrote this book because we were frustrated by the profound environmental and social problems that we face and the lack of any real solutions to deal with them.
The evidence is showing us now that we've reached the end of the era of growth. We're using resources and emitting pollution faster than ecosystems can handle.
In the current economy, the answer to every single problem is to keep doing more of the same. Grow the economy with more people consuming more stuff, but that really can't work.
There are ideas from all over the world showing us how we can do things differently. And we wrote this book to try and put these together into a positive vision for a different type of an economy.
Enough is Enough is about understanding the limits we face and offering a better economic solution that works for both people and the planet.
Politicians are always talking about needing the economy to grow, and we've got to get growth going again. It's almost as though they've never thought about what actually does that mean.
The continual pursuit of economic growth, even by the richest economies in the world, is degrading the environment, drawing down finite resources, and withdrawing the possibilities for future generations to have any meaningful quality of life.
There's a number of areas, a number of these so-called planetary boundaries where we've already gone too far and are playing a game where climate change is concerned, for example, a game of environmental roulette. We also know that where biodiversity is concerned, we're living through a mass extinction event. We know where things concerned with the fertility and productivity of our soil systems are concerned, that we're playing a very dangerous game there. Now there's lots of other ways in which we're dancing very close to the edge.
We know we're pushing up against environmental limits, but what's more surprising is that economic growth is no longer improving people's lives in the wealthy nations. Although income has more than tripled since 1950 in both the US and the UK, people have not become any happier.
We're not getting what we expect to get from economic growth. Not only are things like life expectancy and other things sort of flatlining, but happiness is possibly decreasing. So why keep pursuing it?
One of the problems with growth as a measure is not what it does tell you, but what it doesn't tell you.
The people who actually developed the measure of GDP, they explicitly said, do not use this to measure national progress. This is a gross, inaccurate figure.
GDP is a measure of economic activity, of money changing hands. So if I buy a new bicycle, this contributes to GDP. If the government invests in education, this also contributes to GDP. These are things that we would probably count as positives. However, if there's an oil spill, this also contributes to GDP. If a family gets divorced and incurs costly legal fees, this also contributes to GDP. War, crime, environmental pollution, all of these things add to GDP.
So I think even a child, if it was explained to them what GDP consists of, would quite easily see that it's not a good idea to count growth in bad things as a good.
So we know we have these two fundamental problems. Growth is not sustainable due to environmental limits, and it's no longer desirable in wealthy nations because it isn't improving people's lives. The question is what to replace it with.
From the very earliest thinking of the political economists, the early economists, there was always an assumption that growth would be a transitory phase and that we would arrive at a stationary or a steady state. Now, things will never be stationary or steady. They'll always be in flux, but they should be in flux operating within the flexible limits of the biosphere.
You need to create a macroeconomics in which you can achieve economic stability over the long term without constantly relying on persuading people to buy more and more stuff. This doesn't work. So the first step is to create an economics which is post-consumerist, which gives you stability without relentless consumption growth.
That means an economy of better, not bigger, of quality, not quantity, where we optimize how we do things rather than just maximizing consumption.
We call this a steady state economy, and it has a stable number of people consuming a stable amount of energy and materials, and that's all within ecological bounds. In a steady state economy, the goal of increasing GDP is replaced with the goal of improving people's quality of life.
You start with the goal you want to achieve, and then you work back from that. So if you want to maximise well-being, rather than just economic growth for growth's sake, then you have to think about what are the conditions that improve people's well-being. And obviously everybody needs sufficient, but we don't need excess.
I think what you need really is probably 3 or 4 numbers. The state of the natural world, the state of the economy in terms of output, the state of the social world, inequality, the state of education. Think about what were the key factors in society and say we're going to keep all of those above a minimum level, and we're going to then manage the way we run society to keep them all within a reasonable range.
In 2010, we organized the first Steady State Economy Conference. Over 250 economists, scientists, business leaders, members of the general public attended and contributed. The objective of the conference was to figure out how to build an economy without growth that still allowed people to lead meaningful and happy lives. The book is a direct result of that conference.
In the book, in addition to replacing GDP with new measures of progress, we consider how to limit material and energy use, fix the monetary system, stabilize global population, reduce inequality, provide meaningful jobs, and adapt businesses to flourish in a non-growing economy. Now, I don't think we've got time to go into all of them right now, but I hope we can at least cover a few of them.
One of the interesting things about money is the economists, the experts, don't understand it very well at all. I used to be a volunteer at the British Museum, and I used to work in the money gallery. We thought when we were setting this gallery up, we'd stick a sign on the wall that said, "This is money," with a 1-sentence, 1-paragraph explanation. Then we realised we couldn't actually explain money at all, so they just skipped that part of the gallery.
Most of the money in the economy is actually just numbers in a computer system, and we still think of it as cash, but actually most money now is electronic. The question is, where does that money come from? And unlike the cash, which is only created by governments and central banks, the money that we're actually using for most of the economy is created by commercial banks. So they create money every time somebody takes out a loan. You walk into a bank and take out a mortgage. That money isn't coming from somebody else's bank account. It's actually new money that's created effectively out of nothing through the accounting.
Banks do this with a trick of double entry bookkeeping. So when you go into the bank and you take out a loan, the bank does 2 things. In one column of its books, it enters a liability. This is the money that the bank has created and put in your account. In the other column of its books, the bank enters an asset. This is the money that you owe back to the bank. Now everything is okay because the 2 numbers cancel out.
All of the money that we're using is created as debt. For every pound that's in your bank account, somebody else somewhere has a pound of debt. The entire money supply is on loan from the banking system. And what that means is we have to pay interest on all of the money that has been created. In the UK, this interest adds up to £200 billion a year, has been transferred from the public to the financial sector. The burden of servicing this interest means that businesses and families have this obligation to keep earning money to repay all this debt, but actually the debt can never be repaid.
It's a catch-22. As an individual, you want to pay off your debts. But if everyone in society did that, there wouldn't be any money left because money actually is debt. So if we all pay off our debts, the current economic system would collapse.
What we need to do to fix the money system is remove this power to create money from the banks, return it to some democratic, transparent, accountable body, and make sure that money is created in the public interest and spent into the real economy instead of being pumped into property bubbles and financial markets.
If we had a money system in which governments had sovereign control over the money supply, then it would be perfectly legitimate for governments to invest in the things that we know that we need in order to create a good society, a low-carbon society, a society which is sustainable, a society in which we have more equality. The money system is absolutely key to that vision.
In such a system, we'd still have banks, but they'd only be allowed to loan money which had been deposited with them. It would reduce inflation in the economy, it would allow us to reduce resource use, and it would give us a much more stable financial system.
That kind of framework, an independent monetary authority with the money supply actually under sovereign control but regulated by an independent authority, is a much, much safer route than anything that we had before.
Well, the old cliche about the importance of growth is when people say that a rising tide floats all boats. What people who say that don't seem to realise is that there's a lot of people who don't have any boats, and there's a lot of people who can't even swim. So what you get is a wealthy minority sat comfortably on their yachts, and a lot of people floundering for air at the bottom of the ocean.
There's a great quote from Henry Wallach, the former governor of the US Federal Reserve. He just came right out and said it. He said, "Growth is a substitute for equality of income. So long as there is growth, there's hope, and that makes large income differentials tolerable. But if growth is a substitute for equality of income, then the reverse is also true. Equality of income is a substitute for growth, and a much more sustainable one."
More equal societies have better health. So on average, people live longer, they're less likely to be obese, less likely to have mental health problems, chronic diseases as well. They have higher social mobility, children do better in school, young women are less likely to have babies early, there's much less violence, people are less likely to be imprisoned. So there's a whole range of health and social problems that are much, much fewer.
Inequality is not inevitable at all. It's a result of decisions made about levels of taxation, about how we organise our economy, about how we privilege multinational companies over small businesses, about how we pay our bankers huge bonuses. And at some point in the future, I think we might like to rearrange our wage structure, and maybe the sewer sweeper should get paid more than the banker.
What our research shows is that countries that become more equal through different strategies get the same benefits. So you can achieve greater equality through redistribution, like Sweden, or you can do it through having smaller income differences to start with.
Policies that address inequalities where they originate are likely to be the most effective way to achieve long-lasting equality.
Democracy in the workplace is key here because it's obviously in the workplace that most income differences arise. So if we embrace all forms of democracy at work, whether it's employee representatives on boards, forms of employee share ownership, cooperatives, mutuals, etc., then we find that we have companies that are more of a community, have smaller income differences, and actually, where there's true democracy involved, are also more productive.
To ensure equality, we may need to take some additional steps, such as setting a maximum income across society. And this would do away with some of the most unfair gaps between the haves and the have-nots. David Tepper, a hedge fund manager in the US, pocketed $1,057,692 per hour in 2012. That's as much money as the average American family earns in 21 years.
Within any organisation, the top paid person shouldn't be paid more than 10 times the lowest paid person. If you apply that across society, that's going to have quite significant impact on inequality at the top end.
Besides considering a maximum income, it's important to look at the other end of the scale as well. A guaranteed minimum income would create a fairer society by putting everyone on the same starting line, a line that allows people to meet their basic needs.
Our current situation now is we have a minimum wage well below the living wage. Everyone who's working full-time needs to be paid enough money to live on. And most people, when you say to them, if you work full-time, you should earn enough money to live on, people go, well, yeah, that's a reasonable principle.
Perhaps the biggest fear that most people have when they hear no growth is no jobs. But the evidence for a relationship between growth and job creation is much weaker than you would expect.
There are good ways to maintain jobs in a non-growing economy. Over time, we've figured out how to produce goods and services more efficiently, but we've made some questionable decisions about how to use these productivity gains. We've chosen more stuff over more time. Instead of ramping up production simply to keep people employed, we could use the benefits of technological progress to reduce working hours and then share the remaining work.
We're in a situation in which we have large-scale structural unemployment on the one hand, and people working life-crushingly long hours on the other.
So if we could take more of that time as leisure, then we're giving people the time to pursue other things that enhance their well-being, and we're ensuring full employment.
We know from responses to previous periods of economic turmoil that by reducing the length of the conventional working week, we can create more opportunities for people who otherwise wouldn't have a job on the one hand, and make life more tolerable and pleasant for people who are working too long on the other.
The New Economics Foundation did a rather good paper suggesting that we move towards a standard 21-hour working week.
The length of the working week has been fought over for more than 200 years. There were days when people couldn't even dream about the idea of having a weekend, and that gradually was introduced. At each stage, we were told that working a shorter week would wreck the economy and produce immoral behaviour. Now we know that it's an essential part of quality of life.
On average, workers in the US work 9 weeks more per year than workers in Norway.
In general, labor productivity has been increasing by about 2% a year. Now, if we took those productivity gains and we put them into increasing our free time instead of the amount of stuff we produce, we could quickly reduce the working week. That sounds like progress to me.
Policies for maintaining jobs, reducing inequality, and fixing the monetary system, these are all important changes for a sustainable and fair economy, but that's only half the battle. If these policies are going to succeed, then consumer culture also has to change.
We are consumers. We have inherent appetites for novelty. We love new stuff. We constantly want to engage in telling people how important we are by having that new stuff. And the markets and the advertising persuade us continually that to be decent human beings, we have to have it. What's wrong with that? It doesn't really reflect who we are as human beings.
We've forgotten that growth is just one means to an end, not an end in itself. At the moment, we're making decisions based on whether they're good for growth or good for productivity, not whether they're good for people or the planet.
To get from 3-planet living to 1-planet living is a big change, but we can do that in ways that actually makes everyone's life much better.
We have to be able to paint a positive picture for people, create a vision of a world that they want to live in. That world wouldn't be one of constraint, restriction, doing without. It would be one that is enriched.
We can flourish, have a better balance between our working lives and our own lives, have healthier, more resilient and more friendly and convivial communities, and have an economy which is more stable and secure and flourishing for the long term.
Real action requires us to recognize the limits to growth and to embrace the alternative, a steady state economy. But we have to act now, for time is the ultimate limit that we face, and it's the one thing we can never have enough of.
One thing's for certain, changes are only going to come when we recognize that enough is enough.